and welcome to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. I'm Dr. Nerida, professional equine nutritionist, founder of the MyHappy.Horse nutrition app, and horse person who gets immediately concerned the moment a horse turns their nose up at food. Because here's the thing, a horse that isn't eating is not normal. Something's wrong, and it is our job as their human to figure out what. And I know how this feels. If you're a horse owner, it's a downright anxiety-inducing, sleep-depriving worry. And if you're a trainer, add to that the frustration because you know that horse can't fuel performance or recovery without fuel. So in this episode, I'm going to walk you through 4 of the most common reasons horses stop eating. These are hindgut disturbances, including hindgut acidosis, gastric ulceration, Don mycotoxin and salt issues, which includes too much and too little salt. I'll explain how each one happens, what they look like in real life, and what you can do to fix these situations that stop our horses from eating. Plus, I'll share the story of the tiny cheap thing we did for our very old mare Breeze that brought her appetite back and genuinely saved her life. A horse chewing is one of my favourite sounds in the world. Honestly, I need it as a sleep sounds. So let's dive in here so we can keep your horse making that delightfully munchy sound. So the first cause of loss of appetite I want to talk about is one that I'm super familiar with. So I started my PhD back in the year 2000, and my topic was, how do we process cereal grains so that they're digested in the horse's small intestine and they don't cause disturbances in a horse's hindgut? Because if we feed cereal grains to horses and we allow those cereal grains to travel undigested through the small intestine, the starch that those cereal grains contain ends up being dumped into your horse's hindgut. And in the hindgut, the amylolytic bacteria, which are the starch and sugar lovers, they're like party animal bacteria, they ferment that starch really, really rapidly. And they build up their populations really quickly. They produce massive amounts of acid. And they create a condition that we call hindgut acidosis. And if you continually feeding grains that will end up in a horse's hindgut and have their starch fermented like this, your horse's hindgut ends up in this constant state of acid accumulation. So the pH in the hindgut ends up low and acidic, where a pH in a healthy horse's hindgut should be somewhere around 6.5 to 7.5, so hovering around neutral. And when your horse's hindgut gets acidic like that, their good fibre fermenting bacteria will either shut down or they start to die off. And in severe cases of hindgut acidosis, they'll almost disappear. Well, not almost, they will disappear altogether. So your horse loses a lot of their beneficial bacteria. Now, we talk a lot about hindgut health in previous episodes of the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. If you go back to episodes 9 and 10, and I think also episode 11, there's lots of information there about the microbes of the hindgut and how we need to feed them to look after them and all of the functions that the beneficial microbes have. I won't go into it in detail today, but what I'd love you to understand is that some of these beneficial microbes are actually really important for maintaining the appetite of your horse. So some of them will produce vitamin B1, which we also call thiamine. And thiamine is really crucial for a horse to maintain its appetite. What happens is you lose, so in the state of hindgut acidosis, your horse loses the beneficial bacteria that produce vitamin B1 and the microbes that digest starch, some of the microbes that ferment that starch really rapidly and produce acid. They also produce a compound called thiaminase. And thiaminase is actually an enzyme, so it's a little scissor, and its job is to go around and cut up and destroy vitamin B1, which is not something you want happening in your hindgut, but it is what will happen in the horse's hindgut when they're in this state of acidosis. One of the reasons why horses who have got very disturbed hindgut function and are in a state of hindgut acidosis, one of the reasons they lose their appetite is because they become vitamin B1 deficient. Vitamin B1 is really crucial for appetite. And in fact, in humans, so you all know the condition anorexia in humans. So anorexia is, and it has a longer name in humans, I know, but it just means loss of appetite. And there are many, many, many causes of anorexia in humans, but there are at least some cases where people were supplemented with vitamin B1 and it restored their appetite. And we see this in horses too. And in fact, if you look on the supplement shelves in your local feed store, you'll generally find appetite enhancing supplements. And one of the nutrients those products will usually have in them is this vitamin B1 to restore vitamin B1 levels in horses that have lost their natural vitamin B1 production in their hindgut. Now, of course, a better way to deal with that is not to dump so much starch into your horse's hindgut, which I'll talk about in a minute. I think also the horses that are in this state of hindgut acidosis, they're generally, I see this a lot in race horses. So they're generally on high grain diets. They often don't have a lot of forage or fibre in their diet, and they're getting a lot of grain being delivered to their hindgut and being fermented in there, which produces these massive amounts of volatile fatty acids and also lactic acid. Now, I personally have not seen an autopsied hindgut of a horse that's had severe hindgut acidosis, but I have seen rumens from feedlot cattle. And what you see is that the acid actually eats away at the wall of the rumen. So and in really severe cases, it goes black, it sloughs off, and usually by that stage the cow is dead. So it will kill them when the acidosis is severe enough. But it does even milder levels of rumen acidosis. It damages the rumen wall. And so we have to assume that the same thing is happening in the hindgut of a horse, where the acid is actually eating away at your horse's hindgut wall and causing pain and discomfort. And I think that's potentially also part of the reason why horses in these hindgut acidotic states will go off their food. Often what you'll see in these horses is that they'll still want to eat forage, and horses know that forage is their most natural source of nutrition. So, they evolved for 55 million years as grazing animals on these very high fibre, very varied fibre diets out grazing around on the open grassy plains around the world. And so they tend to, when they've got hindgut acidosis, they tend to still want to eat their hay or their pasture, but they don't want to eat their grain. And I'm sure that they know that it's the grain that is actually making them feel pretty yuck in their gut, so they'll stop eating their grain. And if you see that pattern of loss of appetite in your horse, and you have in that horse's feed bin raw grains or poorly processed grains, so some grains are processed but they're not heat treated or heat treated with enough water to actually make them digestible enough to have the starch fully digested in the small intestine. So sometimes things like steam flaked grains, if they're only given a tiny amount of water and then they're only steam flaked for a very short period of time, it doesn't actually cook the grain very well. So if you've got a horse on a diet that contains a decent amount of grain and the digestibility of that grain is questionable, you're not sure how digestible, so extruded grains and popped grains and boiled grains are pretty reliably, consistently digestible. Other grains processed in other ways can be very variable. So just have a think about what you're putting in your horse's feed bin, and if you've got that pattern of lots of grain with questionable digestibility and your horse has gone off its hard feed, so it doesn't want to eat the feed that contains those grains, but is still happily eating hay and pasture, then you have to suspect that perhaps that horse has got some degree of hindgut acidosis and you need to make changes to that horse's diet. Now, you can measure to some degree hindgut acidosis, so fecal pH is an exceptionally useful measurement. If you have got a stable of performance horses and they are on grain, the best investment you can make in terms of monitoring their gut health is a pH meter, in my opinion. They'll cost you a couple of $100s. You can get soil pH meters where you can literally just poke them into a pile of horse manure and it will give you an accurate enough reading to tell you where that horse's hindgut pH is and whether or not they are experiencing acidosis. And if you measure pH levels in their manure less than 6.2 in fresh manure, then it's more than likely that your horse has got some degree of hindgut acidosis in their hindgut, and you will do a lot of good for that horse if you change that horse's feed to have more fibre and less grain and more digestible grain, so that you're taking that pressure off their hindgut and removing that hindgut acidosis state And what you should see over time is that their appetite will improve and improve really well. So early in my career, I would work with racing stables and they'd be telling me constantly, when the horses get into hard work, they stop eating. And for a long time, even though my PhD was, looking at starch digestibility from cereal grains and the impact on their hindgut and hindgut acidosis, I mean, we measured so many parameters for hindgut acidosis when I was studying. So even though I had all of that knowledge background, it still confused me why these horses would stop eating. And I know now, working with racing stables around the world, that when we feed racehorses, we can keep them in work sometimes for years without them going off their feed. It is not a normal situation for a horse to go off its feed, even when it's in hard work, as long as it's not experiencing pain, you're all over that aspect of training and you haven't overworked them. When everything else is good, a healthy horse should never go off their feed. If they go off their feed, there's something wrong. And I'm going to say in performance horses and particularly in race horses on high grain diets, if your horse is going off their feed, you need to suspect hindgut acidosis. Grab a pH meter, check the pH of their manure and just see where that pH is at. And I sometimes think about they go off their grain but not off their forages, a little bit like if someone got KFC and forced you to eat that day in, day out and gave you very little of anything else to eat. And I know in my own body, especially when I'm away from home and traveling, it's not that we're eating KFC. I use KFC as an example because I usually eat it. I love the smell of the stuff, but then I eat it and wish that I hadn't because it makes me feel so sick. And if someone said to me, "Oh, here, have some more KFC," I'd be saying, "No, thanks. I don't want to eat that again for quite a while. Can I have some salad?" In my mind, that's how I like to think about how these horses feel when they've got hindgut acidosis. So they know that the grain is making them feel sick. They know that more forage and more fibre will make their gut feel a lot better, and therefore that's what they go chasing. So if you happen to have put your horse in a situation where they do have hindgut acidosis, please don't force them to eat grain. So I see in some racing stables, the trainer will actually take away the hay to force the horse to eat grain, and then because they don't have anything else to eat, they'll continue to eat it. But they are trying to tell you something. You need to listen to them, give them the forage, adjust your grain feeding, use different grains, particularly if you've got cracked corn or any type of sliced or crushed or whole corn in the diet, any corn that has not had significant heat treatment in the presence of water. It is the biggest culprit for causing hindgut acidosis in performance horses. So if you have any uncooked corn in your performance horse's diet and they're not eating well, that's the first thing that needs to go. But please, please give them access to lots of forage. That is how they will rehabilitate their own gut. That's how they'll get their beneficial microbes back that will then produce a vitamin B1 for them. You need to listen to the horses and let them do what they instinctively know is the best thing for their gut. So yeah, the fix for loss of appetite due to hindgut acidosis is fix the diet. So the MyHappy.Horse nutrition app will help you to do that. If you need help to do that, it will show you your ratio of forage to grain and make sure that you've got that balanced in the diet. So definitely get your forage to grain ratios correct. Lots of forage, so aim for that minimum of 1.5% body weight. So for average size 500 kilogram horse, that's 7.5 kilos of forage per day. It's a lot. If you're not feeding that much, then you're not feeding enough. And my ideal amount is 2% of their body weight in forage per day if you can get them up to that much and still get enough energy into them. And of course, get the starch out of their hindgut. That's the most important thing in this situation. And you'll find once the acidosis settles, which will happen really quickly when you take the offending grain out of the diet and you get plenty of fibre in there, you will find that their appetite will come back. It might take a little while as their hindgut rehabilitates itself, but once you make the diet change, you should find that their appetite does come back quite quickly. I could talk all day just on this one topic, but I'll move on to the second cause of loss of appetite. So the second classic one, and again, this is often in performance horses, but can happen in any kind of horse, is gastric ulceration. And we tend to, if a horse goes off feed, we tend to, as horse people, go, oh, it must have ulcers. So you do need to be careful not to jump to that conclusion too quickly, because you might be dealing with hindgut acidosis as opposed to gastric ulceration. Oftentimes horses have both conditions, but gastric ulcers are definitely a cause of loss of appetite in all kinds of horses, very common in performance horses, of course, but don't rule it out just because your horse is not a high-level performance horse. And even horses that are not in work can have gastric ulceration. The tricky thing with gastric ulcers and loss of appetite is that loss of appetite is a classic symptom of gastric ulceration, but not all horses with gastric ulceration will lose their appetite. So you can't say that just because a horse is eating, it doesn't have gastric ulcers, just like you can't say just because a horse isn't eating, it does have gastric ulcers. So this is one that it takes a little bit of digging, and the ideal situation is if you rule out other causes of loss of appetite, keep listening to the podcast and we'll talk about a few more of the really common ones, but if you rule out the other causes of loss of appetite, it would be an excellent idea to try and get that horse scoped so that you can actually see into its stomach and see if you are dealing with ulceration, and if you are dealing with ulceration, what kind of ulceration, because depending on the position of the ulcers in your horse's stomach, whether they're up the top or down the bottom, usually the treatment it can vary, and the length of treatment time can vary. This is very, very much a veterinary topic. I'm not going to cover it in detail here because it's out of my wheelhouse, but we will do a podcast in future, or multiple podcasts probably in future, about gastric ulceration. But it's just a really important one to keep in mind when your horse has gone off its feed. I want to share a story from a thoroughbred trainer from years ago now. That Mary had a horse in work. And she was a very, very conscientious trainer, loved her horses and always tried to do the best thing by them in terms of nutrition. But she had this one particular horse that wouldn't eat, and she'd mix its feed up and then it wouldn't eat. And so she started, before I ended up involved, she started doing all of these experiments. So she took all of the individual bits and pieces that horse was being fed. Like it was on, I think, maybe 2 complete feeds, and then it had a rice bran based product in the diet as well, and some chaffs. So she put each of the ingredients that she was feeding into different feed bins, and then she allowed the horse access to all of the different feed bins. And what she found was that the horse was going for this rice bran based pellet. Now, there's nothing really special about this rice bran based pellet. It had some rice bran, it had some various other ingredients in it. But what occurred to me, so I'd been brought in at this stage to try and help with this horse. What occurred to me was that rice bran pellet had no salt in it. And I thought, I wonder, because if you have a cut on your hand and then you get salt in that cut, it really hurts. So I wondered then, I wonder if the horse has gastric ulceration. And my memory is too hazy to remember if we knew that the horse had gastric ulcers or whether we just suspected the horse had gastric ulcers. But it occurred to me that perhaps it was choosing that rice bran based pellet because it had no salt in it and therefore wasn't causing pain when the horse ate. So what I went and did then was kind of reconstructed that horse's normal diet, but without salt. So instead of using the complete feeds that all had salt in them, because most complete feeds do have salt, and rightly so, instead of using those complete feeds, I reconstructed, using individual ingredients, that horse's diet, but I kept all the salt out of it, and it started eating pretty much straight away. It was very happy to eat the feed that didn't have any salt in it. And I thought, isn't that interesting? I wonder how often the loss of appetite with gastric ulcers is simply because it causes pain to eat, and I wonder whether salt is a major contributor to the pain that they feel when they've got gastric ulcers. So it's something that's always in the back of my mind. And if I feel like, or if I know, which is the best situation to be in, and often I do know if a horse has got gastric ulcers because the horse will have been scoped, but for these horses that are ulcerated and are off their feed, and even when they're on treatment, they still have to heal the open wounds in their stomach, so they still feel the pain of the gastric ulcer even when we start treating them. So I always try to take all of the salt and all of the electrolyte supplement out of those horses' diets, so out of their feed, so we're not mixing it into their feed, so that we can make sure that they actually eat the feed that they need to maintain their weight. And if they're still in work, which often horses are when they're on ulcer treatment, they're still taking in the energy that they need to carry out that work. It's easier if they get turned out while they're on gastric ulcer treatment, but that's certainly not the case for a lot of performance horses. So if you've got a horse who's got gastric ulcers, is on treatment, is still in work, and you're doing everything else you can to support the horse, and then they're not, like, their appetite's sketchy, and it might look like, sometimes they eat, sometimes they won't, or it may be that they eat really, really slowly. First step would be just check and make sure you're not putting too much salt in, and I will talk about this in detail towards the end of the podcast, but do check you're not putting too much salt in. And then if you've got salt down to the amount that just meets their requirement, which you can calculate down to the gram using the MyHappy.Horse nutrition app, if you've got it down to the gram, the amount that your horse needs, and their appetite is still not quite right, try taking the salts and also any electrolyte supplements out of the diet for a period of time and just see whether that helps your horse to eat its feed. Now, the tricky thing is that you need to get salt into them, particularly if they're in work and they're still sweating, and we'll do that in various ways. And the way that we do it kind of depends on the horse. Sometimes if you give them access to a pre-choice salt or a salt block, they will go and eat it, or sometimes we might have to use electrolyte paste or salt paste to get salt into them. But yeah, it's kind of a horse by horse. I don't want to go into that too much, but just do be aware that if you take all of the salt out of the feed, that you do need to still give them access to salt. And I will cover that in a little bit more detail towards the end of the podcast. So for horses not eating well, and you either suspect that it has gastric ulcers or it's been diagnosed as having gastric ulcers, just have a play around with the salt in the feed and see if that does help them. Also too, with those horses, just making sure you're giving them constant access to forage so that they can be constantly chewing and creating saliva and buffering their own stomach acid, and keeping their stomach full of fibre and creating a naturally happy stomach will often help them with their appetite. So really avoid having those horses that are picky eaters and you suspect or have confirmed gastric ulcers. Really avoid having them going long periods of time without feed, because that will only make their ulceration worse, and then you're potentially going to make their appetite worse. Hey, just dropping in for a tiny moment. If feeding your horse feels messy or confusing, there is an easier way. The MyHappy.Horse app takes you from guessing to confident in minutes, so you know exactly what your horse needs every day. Think of it as your pocket-sized nutrition genie. Find it at MyHappy.Horse or on the App Store. All right, back to the show. Okay, we'll move on to the next cause of loss of appetite. And this is one, I just threw it in at the last minute because I thought, I really need to mention DON mycotoxin, which is also known as vomitoxin. And the reason it's called vomitoxin is because it makes animals feel really nauseous. And in animals that can vomit, they will vomit. So horses, of course, can't vomit. So it makes them feel really nauseous, but they don't vomit. But what they will do is stop eating the feed. So we saw this, and isn't it, I love how my career gives me the opportunity to learn all of these things on the job. So we saw this when we went out to a farm, and it was Orla who was with me. So Orla, who does the Q&A podcast with me. We'd gone out to this farm because we had been called and said the mares have stopped eating their feed. Now, this mare feed, I had been working for probably, this was maybe 3 years ago now. So I'd probably been working with that mare feed for about 20 years, roughly. And horses never stop eating this feed, ever. They love it. Every animal on every farm loves it. Even the dogs all get into it. But anyway, these mares have stopped eating that feed. And I remember saying to all, there's something really wrong. And it wasn't just one or two mares. It was, they were all coming in and going, no thanks, we don't really feel like eating it today, and walking away. So I immediately suspected, and I can't remember why, but it might have been that there was reports that I'd been reading about grain quality in that season or something. I can't remember exactly why I already was suspicious of Don mycotoxin, but we collected a sample of that feed, sent it off to a lab, and bingo, it was Don mycotoxin. So what you'll see with Don is that the horses will eat, if you get a contaminated batch of feed, the horses will eat the feed for a few days. And then they'll start to go, thanks, but no thanks. We don't really want to eat that. They might pick at it, but in a lot of cases, so I got to see this Don mycotoxin a lot in that season because it was in everything, every batch of wheat mill runs, so the bran and pollard that comes out of wheat flour milling, every batch of that in my region was contaminated. We started testing it and it was scary, in fact, how contaminated that product was. And then a lot of the wheat as well. It was nearly all coming from wheat, so a lot of the wheat was contaminated as well, and other nutritionists. So I chat reasonably regularly with production animal nutritionists, and they were seeing problems as well. So problems in pigs and chickens, and so it was widespread. And yeah, often it was just total loss of appetite for that feed. So the horse would still eat and they were still hungry. So you kind of knew that there wasn't something seriously wrong with the horse because they would be happy to eat other things. So they were still grazing and they're still eating hay. They just wouldn't touch their hard feeds. But it's a tricky one for us as horse owners because if we've been feeding a certain feed for a long time and then all of a sudden you get a new bag of feed and you put it out, your horse eats it fine for a couple of days and then all of a sudden it goes, oh, I don't really want to eat that. Our brain normally goes to, there's something wrong with my horse, as opposed to, I wonder if there's something wrong with the feed. So it's a good idea to just pay attention to if you've just recently changed batches of feed and then after a couple of days your horse goes off that feed, keep in the back of your mind that perhaps it's the feed and not your horse. And in this situation, it was the Don toxin. I have seen it. Many, many years ago, a feed company had batched up a batch of racing feed incorrectly and they'd put way more salt in this feed than what should have gone in. So the horses all stopped eating on that. But do just keep in mind, sometimes it's not your horse. Sometimes it's what they're eating. But we tend to worry about our horses most. So we think, oh gosh, there's something wrong with my horse when they stop eating. But yeah, just pay attention. Next time your horse stops eating, pay attention to when you changed onto a batch of feed. And the tricky thing with this Don toxin is it takes a few days for them to figure out that it's actually their feed that's making them feel sick. But once they figure that out, they'll stop eating it. It's really interesting. Okay, moving on to the simplest cause, but also probably one of the most common causes of loss of appetite in horses, and that is salt. So salt it can cause loss of appetite in a couple of ways. Let's look at the easiest one first. So in fact, the reason that I am doing this podcast now is because a couple of weeks ago I had a message from one of our MyHappy.Horse members, and she said, Nerida, I'm really worried. My horse is going off its feed. We're going overseas. I need to be able to put him out with my other horses so that the lady looking after the horses while I'm overseas can feed them easily and they're all in together. But she said it took him like 3 hours to eat his feed last night. It may not have been 3 hours, but it was a long time, a couple of hours to eat his feed last night. She said, I can't expect someone to stand around for that long waiting for him to eat his feed. And she said, I'm really worried he's got gastric ulcers. So the very brief backstory of this boy is that he came to Celia as an angry young man, she describes him. So he's a thoroughbred racehorse off the track and lots of problems. And so she's always worried about gastric ulcers because of his history and because of the type of horse he is. He's beautiful now. So it's like I was actually hanging on to him at an event a few months ago. He's a beautiful horse. He's very cuddly. And anyway, Celia was worried about gastric ulcers. She said, I hope he doesn't have ulcers. I can't treat him now because we're going away. And I said to Celia, tell me what you're feeding him. So she was feeding him like cupfuls of fibres. So there was, from memory, I can't remember exactly what the diet was, but from memory it was something like some copper meal and a couple of other non-grain fibrous things. So I knew it wasn't hindgut acidosis. There was potential for it to be gastric ulcers, but then she was adding into these. So his total feed was a couple of cups of various things and a little bit of chaff and then 2 tablespoons of salt. And I said to Celia, it's quite salty. Like horses are affected by taste. And one of the things I've loved doing over my 25-ish years now as a horse nutritionist has been figuring out how to formulate packaged feeds, so complete feeds or fortified feeds. How do I formulate them so that horses love the taste of them? And I've found that there's really specific sort of savoury, sweet and salty combinations that go together to make feeds just really delicious for horses. And over the years there's been one particular feed, but many feeds now here and overseas that call like chicken soup for horses because they have this right flavour ratio. Now, for me, a couple of cups of fibre-based feed and then 2 tablespoons of salt is going to be really, really, really salty. And if you think about any time you've sat down at someone else's table and they've cooked you a delicious meal but put way too much salt in it, you can eat that for a period of time to be polite. But then after a while, your body starts screaming at you to stop putting it in your mouth because it's so salty, and the salty flavour just becomes really off-putting. You almost can't. I'm sure you could if you were really needing to impress the person that had cooked you the dinner, but under normal circumstances, you have to stop eating that because it's just too salty. And I said to Celia, I wonder if that's all that's going on here. I wonder if the feed is just so salty that he's, just doesn't like the taste of it. And she said, yeah, he'd sort of eat a bit and then he'd go away and then he'd come back and eat a little bit more and then he'd go away. And I went, yeah, it kind of sounds like how you would eat something that's seriously salty and you're trying to just, eat it and finish it. And Celia had been putting that much salt in because he's a massively heavy sweater. And I find thoroughbreds they sweat so much, and it has been really, really hot for us. And so she was worried about him not getting enough salt, but in doing so put so much salt into his feed that it made his feed taste really gross. Anyway, I said to Celia, let's feed him his normal feed tonight. This is on the phone. I said, feed him his normal feed tonight and then don't put any salt in it and let me know how he goes. So she fed him his normal feed that night. She actually separated out all the ingredients like Mary had with her racehorse, and she said he ate all of the bits and pieces. So she said, I'll see how he goes tomorrow morning with them all mixed together. Anyway, tomorrow morning came and she mixed all his feeds together and he gobbled it down. There's no problems at all. So it was just that feed was too salty. And I mentioned previously the feed company that had botched a batch of their racing feed, and then there was a stable that I was working with at the time, and all these horses went off their feed, and when we tested the feed and found that it was way saltier, like you could see all the fines that the horses were trying to sift out in the bottom. It was way saltier than what it should have been. So these horses were just getting overdosed on salt. So salt, like exactly the same as for us, it makes too much salt just makes a feed taste yuck. And your horse is not going to eat it when it tastes unpalatable. They will just stop eating. And it happens even more so when you exceed their requirement for sodium. So they've got a sodium switch, I guess, in their brain. So when they need sodium, they'll go and consume salt. When they don't need sodium, they are not driven to go and consume salt. And if you've ever noticed, if you're eating salty peanuts or salt and vinegar chips or anything really moreish like that, that's really salty, if you've had a hot day out competing or doing hard physical work outside and you've been sweating a lot and losing a lot of electrolyte in your human sweat, when you eat those foods, it's like, oh, wow, it's just they taste amazing. But if you forced yourself to keep eating salt and vinegar chips, after a while, your brain would start going, okay, they don't taste good anymore, stop eating them. And you would stop because they're too salty. So if your horse's sodium requirement is met, then the salty feed doesn't taste good anymore. So the tricky thing with salt is, and it's such I still haven't nailed how to teach this concept. So hopefully at least some of this will land. But the tricky thing with salt is that the salt requirement actually changes on a day-to-day basis. So there's been a massive heat wave in Australia in recent weeks. So a horse's sodium requirement in the regions that have been affected by this heat wave, or really everywhere in the world. If you're listening from outside Australia, hi and welcome, and you experience heat waves as well. So if your horse gets really hot weather, and particularly if you combine it with humid weather, they sweat a lot and then they lose a lot of electrolyte, so they lose a lot of sodium in their sweat. So in those conditions, sodium requirement goes up and their appetite for salt will increase. So if you feed salt at a level to meet their requirement under those conditions, what will happen if you don't reduce that salt once the weather cools down is your horse will start to go off its feed, because for the cooler conditions, the feed is too salty. So what I try to do and what I try to get stables that I work with to do is to modify salt intake depending on the climate. So when you're hot and humid, put more salt in the feed. When you're cold and the horse is not standing around sweating just to stay cool during the day, reduce the salt. And some horses, there's some funny horses, and I have one of them, little Popcorn. She hates salt in her feed. She just does not like salty feed. And if I put salt in her feed, she gives me a dirty look. She's a funny little thing. And then tries to sift it out as best she can with those amazing noses that they have that will sift out the finest things. She'll sift it out and not eat it. And yet we always have free choice salt, which if you don't have free choice salt available for your horses, please go and organise that. If not today, then this week. Grab a plastic feed bin or a rubber feed bin and stick rock salt or some sort of loose salt into it for them. It's really important they've got access, because Popcorn, who will not tolerate salt in her feed, I topped up our free choice salt yesterday and she was my first customer. She came straight over when I put the nice fresh salt in and stood there for quite a while just licking the salt up. So she'll consume salt. She just doesn't want it mixed into her feed because she prefers her feed to be not salty. So experiment with, if you've got performance horses and particularly race horses, if you're feeding the same amount of salt to them throughout a 12-month period, through winter, through summer and every other season, and you find that their appetites are a little bit inconsistent, start trying to vary the amount of salt you feed, and then also make sure that they've got access to free choice salt. So definitely for stabled horses, you need to give them access to free choice salt. All horses need access to free choice salt, but do vary the amount that you're putting into their feed and then let them top up. If they need more, they'll go and top it up from their free choice salt. And then the last cause of loss of appetite is too little sodium. So, and this was one of these life and nutrition lessons that I learnt, and I will never, ever forget it because of the way that it happened. But our dear old Breeze, who we bought, gosh, it's coming up, it must be 4.5 years ago now, and we got our vet out. I bought her from a beautiful friend who had her for her kids, and then we got Breezy, and my son Bo rode her for quite some time, and my nieces rode her as well. She's a beautiful horse. We know nothing about her history, and when we got her, my vet came and checked her over, and he said, "Oh, Nerida, she's got to be in her mid-30s, and you might get 6 months out of her if you're lucky." So here she is 4.5 years later and still happy and healthy, but we nearly lost her a couple of times. And what happened was she had her feet trimmed, and then that afternoon I found her down on the ground sweating. It was as hot as anything, and she's in the sun. And she had colic. It was quite clear that she had colic. And I was thinking, oh, Breezy, what have you done? And got her up, moved her into the shade, called my vet, did what I could for her to make her as comfortable as possible. I had some bute here, I think, that I'd given her. And then Doug came out, looked her over. So hard to diagnose what the colic is. We didn't know what was wrong with her. And I think she had low body temperature. The details are a little bit sketchy to me. Anyway, she had some good painkiller and she was up. And then later that night, she was grazing and she seemed to be perfectly normal. The next morning, however, she's down on the ground and had profuse watery diarrhea. I was thinking, oh dear, what's happened here? And I videoed it, and then I was heading over to Dr. Doug's, my vet's, anyway that morning, and I took the video over, and he was like, I don't know what would be causing that, but he said it could be worms. So anyway, I egg count regularly. My horses were wormed, but not regularly, because with my climate, we thankfully don't need to worm regularly. But she, I think, is so old that she's lost her natural resistance to worms. So she goes down in a heap if she gets any kind of worm burden. I didn't know this at this time. So we did a course of wormer over 5 days, and then we used a stronger wormer at the end of 5 days. And she was off and happy and eating, and everything was great. And then it happened again. So she'd gone, that was in the summer, she'd gone through the winter, and when we came out in spring, obviously the worms got active again, and it was a warm, wet spring, and she went down with colic again. I was like, oh no, same thing. And I felt terrible. I was like, oh, I've let this happen a second time. And she got the profuse watery diarrhoea again, but it was different this time. So we did the same thing. We treated her in the same way. We gave her the wormer, and she would not eat. She would pick at things, but she just did not want to eat. And I remember Ryan came over, and I was so sad thinking that we were going to lose Breezy. And I remember being out with her that night. It was a really bright moonlit night, and I remember just cuddling her. I'm going to make myself cry. I remember just cuddling her and thinking, oh man, like, are you done, Breezy? Do you want to check out? Like, you are really old. You've done so much for so many people in your lifetime. And I thought that was it. I couldn't get her to eat. I mean, I couldn't get her to eat, and I've got every trick in the book for getting horses to eat, and yet I couldn't get her to eat. Anyway, I got Doug back over the next day, and he said to me, maybe she's just really sodium deficient. And I said, huh? and he said, well, when horses have got profuse watery diarrhea, they can get very sodium deficient, and then when they're sodium deficient, they won't eat. And I'm thinking, why do I not know this? Like, this was only maybe 18 months ago. Why do I not know this? So anyway, we started dosing her with sodium. He said normally we'd put them on a drip, but I didn't. She's so old. I didn't want to transport her, and she was still bright enough, but she hadn't eaten for maybe 2.5 days by this stage, any more than nibbles at things and little bits of grazing and stuff. So we started we gave her electrolyte paste, and then I just started pasting her with a molassesy salt mixture. And once we got that sodium level restored, she just started eating again. It was amazing. And she's still here. At the moment, she is brilliantly shiny and dappled. Like she's this ancient old horse. I just love it a bit. She still bosses all the other horses around and makes sure that she gets her fair go at her feed and things like that. But I honestly thought she was just checking out. I thought, well, she's decided that she's had enough, and that's that. But it was just a sodium deficiency that had completely switched off her appetite. So do be really conscious of that. If you've ever got a horse that, I guess it could happen, and I haven't seen this, but I guess it could happen if you have a horse like, say, an endurance horse that has sweated a lot, and then you haven't replaced the electrolytes enough. If they're off their feed, then keep that in mind, that maybe that is something that could be contributing to it. You can blood test for this. We didn't with Breezy. We just went with the fact that she'd had lots of profuse watery diarrhoea, and that she would be sodium deficient. But you can blood test for it. And, of course, if you've got a horse that has had diarrhoea, severe diarrhoea or diarrhoea for an extended period of time, if their appetite is poor, probably getting some salt into them is a really good idea. It really is a veterinary issue, so work with your vet. I had Doug guiding me on this one, which I was very grateful for. And yeah, I will never ever forget it. So anytime I ever see a horse that's not eating, that has either had diarrhea or has been sweating profusely for any period of time, that will be my first thing I go to, is to either get a blood test done or just get some salt into them. And we did have to paste Breezy because we couldn't get her to eat. So I could not get her to eat salt to restore her own sodium levels. We had to actually give it to them. And if it's a severe situation, then obviously your vets can use fluids to do that, but be guided by them on what is best for your horse, because they're the wonderful people who are best placed to advise you on that. Okay, well, that was a lot of information. I hope it's useful. So there are so many more reasons why horses will go off their feet, which I don't have time to go into just in one episode. If you do want me to cover anything specifically or any of that in more detail, please do reach out to us with suggestions for the podcast, because we're really, really happy and open to podcast suggestions. So do that. Just as a quick recap, if you do have a horse go off their feed, remember that hindgut acidosis is a major cause of loss of appetite, particularly in horses on high grain diets, and particularly when the grain has not been heat treated effectively. You can diagnose hindgut acidosis to a large degree by testing your horse's hindgut pH by using the pH of their manure. as a proxy measure. So grab yourself a soil pH test kit. So you can just use the cheap little test kits from hardware stores or gardening shops that have got the liquid and the powder. You can use them. They work for sure. Or you can buy an actual pH probe and use that to measure the pH. And remember, anything below pH 6.2 is too low and you need to modify that horse's diet. And often what you'll see with horses in hindgut acidosis is that they will go off the grain portion of their feed, but they'll still be very happy to eat pasture and hay. Gastric ulcers are a frustrating cause of loss of appetite because sometimes they do cause loss of appetite, sometimes they don't, and sometimes it's not usually total loss of appetite, and sometimes they'll eat some things but they won't eat others. So gastric ulcers are one of those things that when a horse doesn't have a good appetite, keep in mind that it may be ulceration. Rule out other causes which you can do really quickly and easily. I mean, if you do think it's ulceration, then work very closely with your veterinarian to diagnose and then treat that problem. And remember, if your horse does have gastric ulceration and you're on the path of treatment, salty feeds will cause more pain for these horses, and they'll often be a lot happier to eat if they don't have any salt in their feed. So take their salt out, figure out how you're going to get them that salt and see if they're happy to eat it if you just provide it as loose rock salt. But yeah, if you're in the short term, you may need to just take salt out of the feed of horses with gastric ulcers to get them eating. Don mycotoxin. So if you have received a new batch of feed, the horses have eaten it for a few days, and then all of a sudden they say, no, thanks very much. And the feed, particularly if the feed contains wheat, but it's not only wheat that Don will affect. So it can be in other grains, but it's very easy to send off and get tested. And in fact, if you're buying feed from a feed company and you think that it might be Don mycotoxin, then you should request that the feed company does that test for you, and they should be very happy to do that. Just to rule in or rule out Don mycotoxin or vomitoxin as a cause of loss of appetite. And the last one is salt. If you put too much salt in a horse's feed, it tastes bad and they will stop eating it. And too little salt or not enough sodium in a horse's blood will cause an almost complete loss of appetite. And you need to restore their blood sodium levels to restore their appetite. And it works like magic. Thank you very, very much for listening. If you know anyone that has got a horse that is not eating or not eating very well, I would absolutely love for you to share this episode with them. And if you haven't already, please follow the Happy Horse Nutrition podcast, because it helps us get found by more horse people and we can help them as well as helping you with horse nutrition and all the weird and wonderful things that our horses throw at us when we're trying to feed them. Thanks for being here, and I'll catch you next time. If you'd like to know more about the MyHappy.Horse virtual equine nutritionist, you can head on over to MyHappy.Horse. And also, while you're there, check out the Dr. Nerida AI, which is me in AI format. And that version of me is happy to answer your questions about horse nutrition 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon.